Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic, a heating planet, human heated, these last few decades, and with more in the works. And we're focusing today on this Friday episode of Sustain What, my webcast at the Earth Institute of Columbia University, on one of the big challenges. Well, so many challenges are out there right now related to information and news, as we are buffeted by simultaneous complicated challenges. There's the pandemic, there's the vaccine rollout, there's climate change and climate impacts. Climate impacts can be changing even without climate change. Lots of things are going on, especially in places like Florida. And at the same time, the news environment is changing profoundly, both through the noise level from disinformation and through newsroom shrinkage and utter profound challenges facing the news industry from top to bottom right now. And we're going to talk about some efforts to counter those trends and deal with them, grapple with them at the local level. Many sessions I've had on here have been sort of at the national and global level of journalism on things like the pandemic. But what really matters to people most of the time is what's happening to your climate or your situation with vaccine availability. And that's where these gaps are, and they're profound and disturbing. And then you run across stories like that of CD and CD Davidson-Hier, and you'll hear or hire?
Hires.
Hires. You'll hear from her in a second at the Tallahassee Democrat. The national picture is being tracked by Kristen Hare at the Poynter Institute, and we'll learn from her about this. There's so many trackers right now. This is a COVID-19 tracker, vaccination trackers. And we have now a newsroom implosion tracker, essentially. You've been doing great work there. And also the Tao Center for Journalism at Columbia's Journalism School has a mapped data set on this. And Bill Loveless, colleague over at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia, is helping to foster journalism impact in another arena that is facing profound challenges, covering energy, the energy side of the climate challenge. Great to have you all here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
How are you doing? So I hear it's a little cool in Florida, although it's probably not. It was like 6 degrees here in the Hudson Valley overnight, so it's probably a little warmer.
Well, the rules are slightly different here, so yes, we can agree. The Floridians here can agree that it's very cold.
Yeah, and Kristen, you're also in that Tampa Bay area.
I'm in Tampa Bay. It's 64 degrees right now, which is lovely, but was chilly this morning. I'll tell you, when you raise, I'm a Missourian, I'm from Springfield, Missouri, but when you raise children in Florida, you realize just how fragile Floridians are. So my children today are quite chilly, and the heat in my house, unfortunately, is on.
And Bill, are you in Rhode Island or in New York?
I wish I was in Rhode Island. I'm not in Rhode Island at the moment. I'm at home in Alexandria outside DC, where they say we may have measurable snow this weekend.
Yeah, Sunday, Monday. I think it's heading toward you more than us now, but we'll find out. I want to start by looking at this landscape of information that, here we have Governor DeSantis. This was January 23rd. Yeah, I'm not going to play the audio right now, so you can, there's a lot going on. Florida has a huge number of seniors, and they've been vaccinating. But right below that tweet, there's plenty of stuff about it's utter bull, and there's still a lot of frustration. I think here too in the Northeast, the level of confusion around vaccine deployment is astounding. Even I literally can't keep track of how and when as I approach 65 years old in March, what I do. Can I pre-register? No, the insurance companies, everyone seems confused. So getting back to that landscape, CD, tell us a little bit about your journey to covering COVID-19. You're an education and family health reporter, and you're quite young, in your mid-20s, I think. And so what happened? Just give us a thumbnail sketch of how the last year has played out and how you've grappled with that.
Goodness. Well, I got into journalism because I'm passionate about writing, but ahead of joining the Tallahassee Democrat, I'd never taken a journalism class, which is important for this story because I always have felt pulled to write stories or respond to readers in a certain way because it's the way that the people around me respond to our community. And I've learned everything that I have from the newsroom that I grew up in, so to speak. And so they hired me as a K-12 education and families reporter after a brief away period when I'd been an intern and worked my way up. And then the pandemic hit, and one day we just never came back to our newsroom.
Right.
And I left my coffee mug there, and that was slightly horrifying when I went back. But it just became, you fill in, like you said, you fill in the gaps of information, you follow the flow of information. And I just found myself constantly doing that with COVID-19 data specifically out of the Florida Department of Health because of how much it intersected with schools. There was that huge question of are school campuses going to be safe? Well, what even is this virus? What does it look like locally? Who actually is going to be making these decisions? And then you have educators put in this de facto role of being healthcare experts in a way, or health experts in a way that they're not. And they've always been saying we're not. But since we're all living through the same pandemic, you turn to those sources of information simply for information. And then the COVID vaccine, that topic specifically, when that became available in Leon County, since I've been writing about these daily reports, I just suddenly found myself answering phone calls, literally answering phone calls back to back to back, and writing stories to answer the questions that I was getting. And that's how I've come to the place that I am right this second.
And yeah, so let's hear a little bit about that. Let me just put this back here. So how did the phone calls become the dominant? I assume you're still writing stories. I've seen them on the website, but
yeah, no, I'm still employed. Still
this aspect, answering the phone, you see, reporters are good at making phone calls. They really suck historically. In all my time as a journalist, I was much more making phone calls than taking ones, because usually the taking calls are the ones, maybe 1 out of 20 would be, hey, I've got a tip for you.
Right. And the rest of them are the scary ones, right?
Yeah, or just trying to sell you some new story or something. So how did you work that into your workday, that you're there as an information source, essentially?
It's a great question. I just did is the answer. But the detailed answer is I'd be on the phone with people writing their question down, and I either knew the answer or I looked it up while I was on the phone with them and got the answer and, talked them through it, or really emphasized, this is why I don't know this answer, which people responded very, very well to. And, I would just put it straight into the story that I was writing. And I did have to be much more careful about, reviewing my work before sending it to an editor, just because I was fielding so many phone calls. But it became this really symbiotic approach to journalism, where the exact people that you're giving the information are then giving you feedback on the efficacy of that information, not whether it's factual or not, but just how helpful it was. So it became this impulse to just be as helpful as possible.
And that almost sounds
Andy,
like,
can I?
Yeah,
I just want to add in, because Sadie and I talked early in January for a story that we had at Poynter about this, and what she's doing, and she told me this at the time that we talked, but I think it's important to reiterate for any audiences, is what she's doing is basic local journalism. When people have questions and you have answers, she's answering them. And so of course her editor was like, yeah, do it, just don't let it take up all of your time, he told me. And she, as a local journalist, has the trust of the community from a trusted source in the Tallahassee Democrat. So and then what was remarkable to me about her story is that once she shared, if you have questions, if you haven't gotten through, call me, people did, and it was a virality of a different kind than we're used to, because people were sharing with their loved ones, hey, this young woman at the Democrat can help, and sure enough, she did. I think it's just a tremendous it says a lot about CD and her editors and her community and her newsroom that she was willing to perform this task that she's still, a month later, almost still performing.
It reminds me so much of, I got to know the folks who founded Your Ohio Voice a few years ago, yourvoiceohio.org. It's the Dayton Beacon Journal, old time newspaper. Akron Beacon Journal was struggling and dying and trying to figure out ways to forge a new relationship with the community around it. And the opioid epidemic at the time had struck, and they used that moment as a way to build a new relationship with their community. This is the last 3 years or so. They would hold, this is pre-COVID, obviously, they would hold like town halls where the newspaper isn't going to the city hall meeting. They're holding the town hall meeting. They would bring in experts and sort of facilitate conversations. And I think, I've embraced that method more and more, thinking about climate change too. Even Doug Oplinger, who's one of the founders of this project, a longtime newspaper editor, had embraced this model of sort of deliberative journalism or open interrogatory journalism. What is it you're not hearing that we can help you with? And so it's building really nicely on that. And Bill, I want to get back into the energy side of this in a minute, but I wanted to get back to Kristen on the work at the Poynter, at Poynter. Like, could you just describe for those who don't know Poynter what it is you do, and then zoom in on this local news question?
Sure. So the Poynter Institute is a nonprofit school for journalists, and we're also the nonprofit owner of my local newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times. And Poynter teaches and trains journalists, and we have an editorial team of journalists who are covering the industry. And so my beat, and has been for years, is local journalism, and specifically the transformation that local journalism has to make in order to continue to survive. I was a local journalist for 10 years in Missouri before coming to Poynter. So this is something that I know really well. And so, in the several years that I had this beat before the pandemic, layoffs were, a really unfortunate but perennial part of the job for all of us at Poynter, and I think for all media reporters, and just tracking, the number of layoffs that have happened. Pew Research has some great statistics from 2008 to 2019. Newspaper employment went down by something like 51%. So, our cities aren't shrinking. There is no less news than there was in 2008, but newspapers in particular, because of the business model, because of challenges with technology, because of audience behavior, for lots and lots of reasons, have really had what my boss at Poynter calls a pre-existing condition. So when the pandemic hit, it hit media hard and really broadly. And so I started, we were one after another trying to keep up with the news of mostly layoffs and furloughs in the beginning. And at some point, a former editor of mine messaged me on Twitter, and he said, "You need to put this all in one place." And I did. I sat down on a Friday to try to put it all in one place, and had to take a break because of the weekend, and got back to it on Monday. I think we published by Tuesday. So in April, I started this list of the furloughs, layoffs, and closures caused by the coronavirus. And really through, I updated it again this week. It now gets updated maybe weekly, but there were days when this was all I was doing was trying to have one place where you could see the really dramatic impact that this pandemic has had on all media. And it's not just local newsrooms, although they have been hit particularly hard. I have another tracker where I have it's more than 60 at this point, local newsrooms around the country that have actually closed because of the pandemic. But, Condé Nast had layoffs and furloughs, and, CNN closed its airport network. And so this has been really a, industry changing pandemic for all of us. And our goal at Poynter was to track it, not let jobs disappear anonymously, And it's finally slowing down enough that we're able to start thinking about what recovery looks like. So that's going to be my work this year.
Have you noted any places where there's outliers going in the opposite direction? Yeah, or
Yeah.
there always
Yeah.
are. And are they worth
There-
examining as case studies, or are they just in unique situations?
Yes, and yes, they are. One of the things that I get asked a lot is, well, what's the answer going to be to save local news? And my answer is always, well, it's going to be all of the things, right? Because every community is different. And Berkeley doesn't look like my hometown of Springfield, Missouri. They're going to have a very different mix of the kinds of news that they're going to have. So there are outliers, but I would say, even more of a trend is that the places that got really hit hard were legacy organizations. And unfortunately, those are the kind of places like where CD works that have deep roots in the community and often, really established brands and reputations. But lots of small, independent, local online papers, I think weathered papers. They're digital news sites, but they weathered, I think, fairly well because they're already so lean. And are in some cases a couple years into establishing themselves, don't have a printed product they have to worry about. Maybe they have a nonprofit business model, or have harnessed funding from local philanthropy that's helping them. And then there are some national to local projects that are really exciting. ProPublica's local reporting network has now established actual newsrooms in Illinois and Texas. And one of my colleagues wrote that they, in the last 3 years, have worked on 45 projects with newsrooms around the country. That's really exciting. The American Journalism Project is going to be giving out $50 million over the next 3 years to local newsrooms that already have, a bit of roots and to help them extend their runway. So there are lots of exciting things out there. The other thing that we're working on now at Poynter, along with two university professors, is a look at the local independently owned weeklies in the Midwest. Those newsrooms, while certainly teetered on the brink, survived because they are so close to their communities. And in the case of every newsroom, I think around the country, if people didn't believe in the power and the necessity of local news before now, having to know, what the infection rate like is where you live. The Tampa Bay Times, which I'm a subscriber and a contributor to, has a tracker that I check every morning. I check my zip code to get a sense of like what is safe, and that is just a huge service. And so it's gone from sort of news you can use to news you cannot live without. The challenge for this year in recovery is going to be, how do you continue to show how valuable you are after you've earned people's trust? And how does that translate into financial support and stability?
Yeah, just briefly showing here a tweet of mine from last fall, when I was suddenly realizing that the COVID-19 tracking project that the Atlantic, Alexis Madrigal and others had devised early last year to try to fill some of those data gaps. It felt like a new form of public service journalism. When I was growing up, the Times or others, the paper I worked at, or others would be pursuing those Pulitzers, thinking about 5-part series on corruption or something, and getting the big gong, the big Pulitzer. And I think this is a new form of public service journalism, writ large in a national scale with COVID-19 tracking, and writ local with what CD and the Tallahassee Democrat are doing. It's this engagement. It's sort of proving your worth on a daily basis, and it feels pretty exciting to me. And Bill, let's switch a little bit to the energy and climate landscape, and then we'll get back to some of the what do we do next to sort of spread the gospel of what can happen at the local level. Bill, tell a little bit about your background in journalism and in business and journalism and what you've built at Columbia.
Sure, Andy, thank you. First, I'd like to note that I got my start in local journalism with the Pawtucket Times in Rhode Island and covered cops and zoning boards, city hall, Sometimes it seemed all at once. But I have to say, though, I was fortunate to have good editors in those days, and the standards they set for me then were ones that lasted throughout my career.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often told journalism students and all, or people interested in going into reporting, that boy, those first editors you get are so important because they can make a huge impression on you.
Yeah.
I spent most of my career in Washington in trade press for McGraw-Hill and Platts, covering energy and reporting for newsletters and news services, and I did a TV show for a while, but all with an eye towards what was happening in Washington on energy policy and regulation, and I've continued to work on that now at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, where we've established a program in 2017 called the Energy Journalism Initiative to bring reporters to New York once a year. This is pre-COVID. We do it online now, for deep dives over 4 days on complex topics associated with the energy and environment beat, all with an eye towards helping them to report better and more effectively. And boy, it's so important, I think, for a reporter. It's such, really an unusual opportunity for a reporter to have 4 days off the beat, right? To learn, just to spend learning. So I really enjoy working on that program. And we have, it's 20 reporters we bring annually involved in the seminar. Most of them are from the U.S. There's some from abroad, and some are from the big media outlets, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and all. But I have to tell you, and again, this gets back to maybe my Pawtucket Times days. I find it so important to make sure we have some reporters who are from local press. I've had reporters from the newspaper in Odessa, Texas, in Sacramento, in Springfield, Massachusetts, Albany, from public radio stations in West Virginia and Minnesota and Vermont, New Hampshire. Because while they may not be doing the big stories that get all the attention on social media that you may see in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or whatever, they're the ones like you, CD, who are at that local level, who are covering, in their case, the zoning boards, the city council, what's happening in terms of decisions that are being made locally that are impacted increasingly now by climate change. Where you build things, how you deal with flooding, what do you do about infrastructure? What once may have seemed like relatively minor issues now really fit into this overall discussion about climate change. And so, to me, it's as important to have those local reporters there participating in this program as it is to get the big guys from the big papers and all.
And I think one of the, there's so many downsides to the pandemic. You can't even count them all.
Yes.
Devastating, personally, at every scale, community, economically. But it did, by forcing us online, created some spectacular opportunities as well. A lot of our programs in my initiative have gone online, and it's allowed me to work on training journalists in all around the world, working with Global Press, which is a network of female journalists, basically all through the tropics and Pakistan and areas like that. And we help them cover climate risk, and we're going to do more sessions with them. And I never could have done that in the old days. It's connecting them with data. And I think what CD was talking about, especially what people want is data. They want information. Where is the vaccine available? How reliable is it? Which one is better? So we're at a moment when there's an incredible opportunity to create for local journalists anywhere, from Rwanda to Tallahassee, the capacity to connect with expertise and information and help their communities do so. So that feels like a good part of this. Going forward, I hope that aspect of what's been going on can persist. It does mean a lot of screen time.
You can reach a lot of people, right? Through the screen, but you also miss out on those opportunities to rub elbows with people and to pull them aside, right? And
Totally.
I can remember days in a newsroom for Platts downtown where, some reporters would be covering hearings on the screen, and I would say, well, get out of here, go to the hearing. There's a serendipity factor. You'll meet somebody,
Right.
you'll come across something you hadn't even thought about before. But
I think the pandemic, despite all of its downsides, and there are significant ones, it has been a great unifier in a way. I mean, we all are going through the same thing. So when you call up somebody that you ahead of time would think about, how am I going to break the ice with this person and find a common ground? You make one comment about not having left your house in 4 days, and they're like, yeah, same, So there's that.
I know. The other thing about the pandemic, it's kind of the inverse of climate change in that local behavioral change actually can reduce risk.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, again, another reason why the local reporting is so damn important. It did some, and I think the more we can do to think about creating the capacity to reach out for information when you need it and where you need it, and to have that translational aspect of, like Yorvos, Ohio, in a room, they would get people together with communities to help hash out where do we go from here on that, the addiction pandemic. One frontier for me is how do we do that here on this, this thing. I think we can. And I think part of that inevitably will be online, even after, assuming we have an effective vaccine rollout. So that seems like a challenge. I don't know if Poynter, actually right now, this morning, Maren McKenna was doing through the Knight Center at the University of Texas, doing a fresh tutorial online for journalists on how to cover vaccination issues. And that feels like, I've had her on here twice talking about that. So I hope we can keep pushing forward. There's a couple of comments that have come in. I'll show them here. Marcelo Martinez from Venezuela, fraternal greeting from Venezuela. Very good job that Davidson is doing, helping all those people. A great community work.
Thank you.
I'd love to find out more, Marcelo, about how the situation in Venezuela is, particularly Brazil right now is a nightmare. I just was trying to get Tom Phillips, who's covering the Manaus, Brazil situation, on this show, and maybe he'll be here soon. And here's Annabelle Asher, says, I published a small regional magazine in northern New Mexico for nearly 5 years. When the pandemic hit, all my advertisers canceled in one day. Yikes. All my distribution points, I had to stop printing. The local paper, in contrast, is as healthy as ever. There are reasons for that. There is a certain rich component in this town, and they support the paper no matter what. Interesting lessons there. I don't know, Kristen, if that region has come across your radar. Have you dug in with anybody there?
That certainly is. New Mexico is certainly on the list. And Annabelle, I'm so sorry that you've gone through that. This has just been devastating at so many different levels, from publishers to reporters to advertisers. And one of the I wrote a piece at the end of 2020 about some of the big lessons that I've learned from covering layoffs and the pandemic for the last year. And when we talk about what this, that has happened to the industry, we have to, make sure we're opening the tent up enough to include publishers and the people who run the presses. They were one of the really noticeable groups of people to lose jobs last year. I counted at least 1,500 from newsrooms deciding to go online and cutting print, mostly or entirely. And, people who work in advertising and people who work in marketing. I've heard from people who work in essentially every part of the media, and they have all been hit. So, journalists, we like to tell stories. We're good at sometimes telling our own stories very well, but these are also jobs in communities, which I think Annabelle's point, she's making this point too, that whole communities are affected by this in different ways, but these are all local jobs that are also really suffering because of the pandemic.
One thing I was going to ask you, CD, is there more of a collaborative element among small papers in Florida these days? I do recall a year or two ago, these were bigger papers, but it was editorial boards were starting to create a consolidated approach to climate change, how they covered climate change in the editorial side. And I don't know whether on the pandemic, there's been more of a sort of collaborative element or not.
Well, it's interesting because I think I've said this before, but nothing with reporting on the pandemic is ever as it seems. We all left our newsroom, and you think that, okay, there goes your community access, your community touch, but it really doesn't, because of the great unifying aspect of it, but also because these questions are so important that people need answers to. So to get to your question, some of the reporters that are in my network that cover K-12 education, that cover COVID specifically, I started reaching out to them almost immediately, more than I had before, where I was just aware of what they were working on, to ask these granular behind the scenes questions of, in your community, how are you approaching this question? Like, what about the kids in your community who need food that the schools provided? How are you covering that story? Who have you thought to reach out? And so there's been a huge, at least for me, emphasis on collaborating with other reporters in my network, just to get a sense of how they're doing what they're doing, because we're all learning a new way of reporting right this second. It accelerated that journalism wave that we were on, where journalism is so much more tied to social media or the online 24/7 aspect. So,
and when you
Andy,
say
there's also the Florida Climate Reporting Network, which is several newspapers: Tampa Bay Times, I think the Miami Herald, Orlando Sentinel, the South Florida Sun Sentinel, and WLRN are all involved in that, and have been for years, in sharing together and working together to cover climate. And that collaborative approach is at the statewide level, and also national to state and national to local, really important, because when you have fewer resources, if you can work together to pool reporting that matters to your community, that's super important. The Times-Picayune in New Orleans worked with the New York Times a few years ago to do just that, to cover sea level change. And those kinds of collaborations are challenging because it's hard. We're all working on different platforms and networks, and lots and lots of different challenges, but our communities don't care about that. They care about getting information. And I see more and more newsrooms making the choice to work together despite all of those challenges, including with the coronavirus.
I mean, I've often seen that potential, because if you're collaborating on the bigger picture information, and then you're each one tunes its coverage to their local population and readership. So it's not even competitive. It's
no, it's not. It doesn't, or at least right with the people that I'm talking about, it doesn't feel competitive in the least. I mean, it's the kind of camaraderie that you need right now. I mean, you have the people in your newsroom that you call up, but that specific challenge on your beat of how to answer a question is what you need from somebody who knows.
And Andy, as I look at that picture you're putting up right now of how climate change is affecting Florida with those day tidal surges.
Right.
Here's Florida, which is, among our 50 states, among the most imperiled by climate change, most put at risk. At the same time as we're all experiencing this pandemic, I wonder, for reporters like CD, who are covering this locally, what lessons they learned from their coverage of pandemic that could apply to their coverage of climate change, and how they perceive public attitudes on both. Is there a similarity? Have we learned lessons as individuals from our experience with the pandemic that might apply to this ongoing risk we face with climate change? And how do we report on that as journalists?
I think we're still in the middle of a crisis, or at least answered totally for myself. I think I'm still feeling like I'm in the middle of a crisis and answering the questions that I'm getting right now. I'm absolutely confident that there are lessons learned even from 9-10 months ago when I started doing this. But to project that into the future is going to be tricky because they're still solidifying and it's still so organic. But one of the things I think, and this is a little vague of an answer, but is just the amount of humility that we all understand as journalists, that we go into reporting on any topic that's beyond us. but the amount of humility it takes to report on a topic that so deeply affects you, or so in a very visceral way affects you, but caring about the people that it affects that you're reporting on. And I think that, I hope, that kind of heart comes through with all of the stories that not just that I do, but my newsroom does. Because as I think, Bill, you were saying, or Andy, or Kristen, I think you maybe have said this, we are part of the communities that we're writing about. We're not separate. So it's you really do feel the thing that you're reporting on.
I'm going to inject something that takes us to a wider scale even than journalism. One thing that struck me as I'm listening is that the Climate Reporting Network, you're building relationships that then can transcend climate. Obviously, when the same newsrooms are hit by another crisis, you already know each other.
Mm-hmm.
You can start to build with adaptive capacity. You can just shift gears and say, well, okay, how do we connect to COVID information? I've seen the same thing very early here, way back last year in March or April. I connected with community organizers in Bhopal, India. They weren't journalists, but they had an existing relationship across Bhopal, which is infamous for the environmental disaster there in the early 80s from toxic gas. But they had a plastic recycling project. So these were just sort of middle-class, spirit, community-minded people who had a network to build a plastics program for Bhopal. COVID hits and they turned it into a food distribution network because they're already hooked up. And this accountant he was the driver. And I actually, on this show, one of the screens was filled with him driving to a lockdown neighborhood. They had this massive lockdown in India, and poor people had no way to get water or food or even a couple of rupees. So that once you have that connectedness, then you can adapt it, find new ways to integrate it. I think that is one of the big lessons I take from being a journalist in that one-way street method of journalism that certainly Bill and I grew up with. Writing a good story, putting it out, and you're done. Go on to the next one. You might get a couple of letters, maybe a phone call. And it feels so divorced from actual solutions to me now. That's why I get excited about stuff like what the Tallahassee Democrat is doing and what Poynter is trying to highlight, and Bill's, the training as well. Just saying.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I think, and I'm almost 4 years into a reporting career, and so I have only 4 years of lessons to apply to that. But it's interesting to hear you bring up topics like this, because with COVID, one of the things is that it never goes away. It's never a story that you can put down and move away from. So it feels like this one big story that you're constantly editing and re-understanding how things are working. And I think, maybe Bill, to answer your question, maybe that will be one of the lessons we learn, is just how much it's not individual stories, but all these tiny little pieces that you feed into the bigger picture that will make sense at some point.
Kristen, one thing I found in running this program for energy journalists is I have a greater appreciation of the proliferation of new models for local journalism, including the nonprofit model. Because one thing we do carefully when we vet the applications for this program, and we only pick 20 for the annual program out of a large number, is we want to make sure they're bona fide journalists, not somebody who writes whatever for someplace, but, we want journalists. And we very carefully vet these to make sure they are. But in doing that, we find there's a lot of new entities, for example, these nonprofit entities. And as I look closer at them, I'm sort of old school. I say, oh, what are these things, nonprofit? But as I look at them, they seem bona fide. I had one young woman from Richmond, the Virginia Mercury in Richmond, Virginia, in the program last year, who I've learned more about those sorts of things. There's just more models out there now. I think especially on the local level for local news coverage.
And CD, this related to what Bill was saying, I want to ask you about this network model. You mentioned the word your network. What is that? Like when you think of your journalistic peers who form that. What is it, and how does that? What's the dynamic? Is it
Well,
Twitter?
there's two different answers to that, because we do in fact have like an in-network, if you will, Gannett with Gannett Papers and USA Today properties.
Oh, right, of course. Yeah.
Right. So there's several, like COVID-19 reporting groups, or one, Florida, and then there's the education reporting one. But then there's also, I guess what you could call subgroups, where you see that somebody's working on a story that you're interested in, and you reach out to them, and then you find out that they're working on it but in conjunction at the same time as other people throughout the state. And there's several reporters that I go back to constantly. And it is I think you asked what that feels like, or
what's the dynamic? Is it emailing? Is it
phone calls?
Phone calls, yeah.
Phone calls. Yeah, there's definitely a few. Like at TC Palm, Summer Brugal, she's a K-12 education reporter. We probably talk almost every day just to check in, because we have the same challenges. What with getting responses from public officials, specifically now when there's so many unknowns, and what unknowns can you leave unknown for right now? Today, being a Friday, what do you have to answer by deadline?
Yeah. So, by the way, what are you working on?
What am I working on?
What am I taking you away from?
Several things. We can talk later if you'd like.
That's okay. No, that's cool. And Kristen, Poynter does, as you said, it's a school. I think my friend Tom Yulesman many years ago did a climate journalism syllabus or something for you guys. What do you train people in now? How much of it's related to newsroom sustainability versus reportorial impact?
That's a great question. We, like I think the rest of the world in our industry, really had to sharply pivot in March of 2020 when the world shut down. And we realized that we had a huge responsibility to very quickly help journalists figure out how to work remotely, to help newsroom leaders figure out how to lead remotely, and then how to cover this pandemic. So we normally, I think I would say that we have, lots of, one of the fun things about working at Poynter when I'm there in person is, you just get to see lots of people coming through, which is wonderful. But we're now all working virtually, and Poynter's always had our online teaching. We have devoted a newsletter by my colleague Al Tompkins called Covering COVID-19, and he's just every single day hitting all of the news and helping people think about how to localize it. And, I think that the big thing we're going to be thinking about next is, like I said earlier, what does recovery look like when people are ready to go back into newsrooms? For the new places that have newsrooms still, lots of places have left their physical newsrooms. What will that look like? What should it look like? And so I think this year we're trying to be real forward thinking, including, reporting on vaccinations. We have the fact-checking network at Poynter. We have MediaWise, which works with people of all different ages to use social media to do fact-checking. And we also have PolitiFact. So, we sort of are an onion, and you just keep peeling us back, and each of those things are important. But, I think that the thing, I want to answer something that CD was talking about. I think what we're going to see, moving forward, and I have hopes about this for coverage of climate change, is the pandemic became everyone's beat. Mm-hmm. There is no journalist who is working today who doesn't in some way or another cover the pandemic. If you are, an education reporter, you are writing about whether schools are open and teachers and, right. How kids are learning virtually. People who cover food. I wrote about a food critic in California who created a COVID comfort tracker and went to restaurants and let people know based on his criteria, which he used the CDC, guidelines, here's how you can feel about eating in this place. And so we have now, seen, I think, more than any time, certainly, and I'm 42, in my lifetime, what it means for everybody to cover the same story at the same time from different angles.
Mhm.
Before the pandemic, we were starting to see some aspects of that creeping in. There are a lot of journalists in California who, while covering wildfires, local journalists who have worked climate change into that, because it's part of the story. It has to be. So I am hopeful that now that we know, but we've had to learn how to take a holistic approach to a story that's affecting everyone's lives, that that's something we can continue to apply to
Yeah.
other really urgent crises, moving forward.
And
Some
I
of
wanted
that.
to
Oh,
say,
sorry.
I'm sorry,
CD.
Andy.
No,
I
no,
just
no.
want to say, I'm sure both you, Bill, and Andy understand Poynter and where Kristen works. But, as a local journalist, like Poynter is a place that I would check. And when the pandemic hit, it was one of the resources that I and my colleagues relied on for reporting on what reporters are going through and what reporters are doing. So it does serve as that immediate resource for us.
One thing that what Kristen was just describing requires is a lot of newsroom crosstalk. When a story is every beat, Bill, I know you've seen this. I guarantee. In all my time on the climate beat, I've been horrified, even at the New York Times, when I'll see a story in the real estate section about North Miami Beach towers are going up, and not mentioning the fact that the beach is going to be 200 yards further inland in 40, 50 years. And on COVID-19, the lifestyle reporters at the Times were writing these woe is me story about rich people having to struggle to understand how to live in a big house in the suburbs because they moved out of their apartments. And there's many other layers to that. Without someone who's like the health reporter or the health editor having at least an eyeball on stories that are coming in these other arenas, you end up in trouble all the time. So, and that's still like one of the path-dependent challenges in newsrooms and in universities is that people don't talk to each other. I hope that's something we can avoid. I don't know if CD, you've seen that sort of in the landscape of stuff you see in Florida, just the news flow.
I mean, to each their own. Newsroom. Speaking specifically for mine, we have a very close. All the reporters have a very close relationship. We are smaller but mighty newspaper, and the newsroom crosstalk that we had before the pandemic, I really feel has continued to exist during the pandemic. I get. I love them, but interruptive FaceTime calls, from somebody with a 30-second question, because with those kinds of things that you're working on your story right now, and that, somebody else has the answer, it's not better to put it in an email. It's better to say it out loud and have somebody who knows how you report, knows how you write, hear the nuance in your voice to try and catch that and edit you while you're still writing.
So we're in the last 10 minutes here, which is where I try to pivot toward what do we do next, including like what could we do next week that could facilitate better stuff. And when I say we, I mean what I'm doing at Columbia is basically trying to build. I'm looking at the landscape of information and the landscape of problems and saying, with a focus on sustainability, which includes pandemics, and saying, well, where is the problem? A lack of information, meaning no news flowing where it needs to flow, or a lack of a good conversation, where people just aren't hashing out a tough issue like masks in Florida. There's no easy answer to that question. So how do you have a better conversation about it? And Bill, is one of several entities here that supports journalists getting better at what they do, and part of what I'm doing. And Poynter is obviously in the mix too. And you have the Tallahassee paper, and you have your network. So with that landscape, I think there's some stuff we could think about working on. I don't mean literally next week, but looking at these persistent problems, climate risk, pandemic risk, it feels like we could do better jobs of creating those kinds of interfaces. I don't know what comes to mind. Maybe CD, we'll start with you because you're on the ground, literally grappling every day with dozens of phone calls from elderly or other people who are frustrated. Mm-hmm. Is there some tool or capacity that would make that easier?
So many answers to that one. But you know the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I think that one of the things that has radically changed, especially since the vaccine became available, because of who it became available to. This is the demographic that, reads newspapers, subscribes. People are consuming local information, and I am absolutely thrilled by that. I'm totally overwhelmed with what I'm doing and the calls I'm getting, but I'm the most hopeful that I've been all pandemic. And so I think it's compassion, it's humility, it's reaching out to your community, yes, but then also believing that your community will reach out to you, and because it has to be that give and take. It's not a I'm not an expert on a topic, but I am an expert at getting information. So being able to communicate that to people, that they are always welcome to call me, or they always welcome to ask a question. And that, I think, also has to do with making yourself available. As Kristen said, I did write a column the 2 days or day or two later after all of these calls. And I said, if you haven't heard back from anyone in a week, give me a call. And people are still citing that a month later. I'm getting text messages, and I have no idea who many of the people are who are texting me. I just respond. And so it's a combination of all those things.
You're going back to a model that I'm sure Bill remembers of the famous columnists. There are more than one who would like ask so and so. And I'm forgetting.
Right? Oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought about that. Yes, I suppose.
Bill, who's the one I'm forgetting? There's from
Oh, there was there was the Dear Abbeys and the Dear Anns.
Dear Abbey, you're right. Dear CD.
But just emphasizing, that I am a local journalist in Tallahassee doing this for the Leon County community or the surrounding county sometimes. But there is a journalist in every single city, even if it's not a local journalist, but a journalist in every single city who would do exactly what I'm doing. Maybe not text, they will respond because we care about where we are and we care about facts.
And Kristen, taking that to the wider landscape, is there a way to fast track more of this, or is it just hard work? Scale is always this big nightmare.
Hard work. Yeah. And local journalism, I believe, isn't meant to scale. It's meant to be right where it is and to reach into people's lives and help make them better. I think you can see from, talking to CD and like she said, most journalists, local journalists, are just like her. There is no lack of heart or commitment to being a part of a community and making a community better and making sure that people are informed. The big challenges, in addition to questions around business models, but also I think tied to questions around business models, is it has a lot to do with technology. We have very sophisticated users thanks to our cell phones. And unfortunately, a lot of local news digitally has not caught up. So, what we need is a Jeff Bezos to come in and help all local newsrooms have fantastic, CMS systems. We need Google and Apple and Facebook to do more than pay local news lip service and throw pennies after real problems. And, I personally think we need an increased local ownership. We need people who live in places and care about places and know that journalism, it has to be a business, it has to make money, but this is not a place to get rich. This is a place to do fulfilling, important work for your community.
Yeah, and that's what spurs so many of my journalist friends over the decades. When I was at the journalism school at Columbia in 1981, Dean Osborne Elliott said, "You didn't come into this field to get rich. You came into this field because you have heart." And it's good to see that that's being sustained. So we're kind of going to close out now. I want to make sure I don't eat into too much time for a reporter like CD getting so much good work done on the ground. thanks for what you've been doing. Thanks for sharing your time here today.
Thank
And
you
I
so
see another comment here. John Masseter Jr. says, I've been doing this kind of journalism for 50 years, and I'm loving the insights CD is voicing about collaboration with quote unquote competitors and with the communicating. So some positive reinforcement there. Poynter is doing great work. As I said earlier, Maren McKenna, hardworking journalist and author, is just today doing another round of her vaccines journalism school. I'll share that on Twitter. Actually, I already did. And Bill, what you're doing at the energy on the energy side here is great. I know that you're just opened up for this summer, June Institute.
Yep. Well, our annual event, our annual seminar will be June 15th to 18th. Again, it'll be online this year because of pandemic. We'll have I'm previewing it here because we'll have the formal notice out on Monday of acceptance of applications for journalists from big and small outlets who are responsible for reporting on energy and climate and environmental issues. So I do hope to see some, and I expect to see some applications, some local journalists as well.
Having grown up in Rhode Island, maybe it'll be the Pawtucket newspaper.
Yeah, never know.
So this is the tail end of our show. I'm going to show what we're up to on Monday. My Monday sessions every Monday, or it's what I call Thriving Online. They're skill building and skill sharing for anyone, journalists or academics or students or members of the community, on how to get the most out of this information environment we're all living in. And this Monday is Julie Scelfo, a former friend of mine from the New York Times, who has transitioned from newspapers to how do you trust the information you're seeing in front of you. She calls this being media savvy, builds on sessions I've done with, actually, Bill, with a Rhode Islander, URI's Renee Hobbs, who runs the media
Right.
literacy education hub there. Get media savvy with us on Monday. And let me just pull up one more. But every Sunday, we kick back and I focus more on music and the arts as a way to stay sane through these tough times. And we're having this most remarkable guitar designer and banjo player on, Fred Carlson, who I saw his stuff after I escaped a climate journalism conference at University of California, Santa Cruz, to go to a guitar show there several years ago. And he had this instrument called the Humanitar, which is this giant thing. He'll be on the show on Sunday with many of my friends. So that's it. This is Sustain What, the Friday edition. Hope you all stay safe from a distance as far as that's necessary, and in person with those who are in your bubble. Great to have today Tallahassee Democrats CD. I don't have your last name.
Davidson-Hier.
Davidson-Hier. Yeah, it's too small on my screen to see. Bill Loveless from the Center on Global Energy Policy, and Kristen Hare from Poynter. Maybe we can come back and review the bidding in a couple of months to see how things are going and see what we can do next. So thanks again for being part of.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, love to do so.
And anyone out there, this all gets archived right away as a permanent video in 4 different places. So if you need to get in touch with feedback on today's issue, today's edition, or ideas for episodes to come, all that scrolling bar at the bottom has everything you need. Thanks again, everyone.